let's get into the Covina Massacre. Christmas Eve, Bruce Pardo showed up at the Ortega family home owned by Joseph and Alicia Ortega. They were having a Christmas Eve party that had all 5 of their adult children, their children's spouses, and all their grandkids. By 11:30 p.m., most of the kids were at the back of the house playing video games, and one of the grandkids, 17-year-old Michael, was upstairs on the computer sending emails to his friends. The adult Ortegas were around a table in the dining room playing poker. At 11:30, there was a knock on the door. Since the Ortegas were expecting more guests, they let 8-year-old Katrina open the door, her mother close behind. When Katrina opened the door, she was ecstatic to see Santa standing there, and she called out to Santa and ran towards Santa, but Santa reached into his coat, pulled out a handgun, and pointed it at little Katrina. He pulled the trigger, and the bullet grazed Katrina's face. There was a lot of commotion in the house. Letitia grabbed her daughter and ran out the front door, while Santa went further into the house, firing randomly at first, and then finding the group of poker players hiding underneath the table. He shot each and every one of them. After that, Santa opened the package that he was carrying, pulled out a homemade flamethrower, and he started pumping out gallons and gallons of high-octane fuel. But there was an open source of flame somewhere in the house, and it ignited, causing an explosion, and for the fire to come back on Mr. Santa, who, as you already know, is Bruce Pardo. Anyway, he was burned, so Bruce turned around and took off out of the house while there was an explosion. The house was up in flames. Bruce went out to the street and stripped out of his Santa suit, threw it onto the passenger seat of his car, changed into some dark clothing, and got into the driver's seat, put out the lights, the street lights, and took off with his lights off. But neighbors got a good look at the vehicle, took down the details, including the plate. And at the same time, Letitia had called from a neighbor's house where she had sought refuge with her 8-year-old daughter and her husband, and she had reported that Santa Claus had gone into the house and shot up the place. She was terrified. It was a heartrending 911 call, as she's stating that she doesn't know how many of her family members are still alive, and she did identify Santa as being her ex-brother-in-law, Bruce Pardo. Letitia, her husband, and little girl left the neighbor's house and got themselves over to the hospital in order to treat 8-year-old Katrina's gunshot wound. So she was not on hand when all of the first responders, police, fire, ambulances, etc. arrived at the Ortega home. They had to spend several hours and 80 firefighters in order to put this fire out. Also in Los Angeles County, a few hours later, police responded to the call of Brad Pardo. Brad Pardo had come home from a Christmas Eve party himself, and when he got there, he saw that somebody had broken into his house, and when he got into his house, he found his brother Bruce deceased on the couch, puddle of blood, and at the time, just with the information they had going on, law enforcement assumed that there was a shooter on the loose. Bruce had one 9mm handgun in his lap and one on the ground near him when they found him, and they assumed that he had not unalived himself at that point. It wasn't until later that they figured out through autopsy that he had unalived himself, so they're thinking that there's some kind of maniac out there, and they were wondering if there was a tie between Bruce Pardo and the Ortega shooting. Then they discovered Letitia, and Letitia let them know that Bruce Pardo was her brother-in-law, or had been her brother-in-law. His divorce with her sister Sylvia had been finalized on the 18th of December. And then they went further into examining what all went into this crazy thing, and they found out that Bruce and Sylvia had a very contentious divorce. Bruce had been fighting the terms of the divorce. He had not wanted to pay the spousal support that he was told he needed to pay. He got fired from his job right after being told that he needed to pay $1,700 a month. So then they said that he didn't need to pay any spousal support, that he was going to have to give Sylvia a $10,000 one-time payment, and he needed to give back the wedding rings. She got to have the dog, while he got to keep the cars and the house. He was fighting that too. He was supposed to have made this payment of $10,000 a few days before the massacre. And it's chilling what was dug up in the investigation of this whole thing, which is that Bruce had been planning this attack for at least 6 months. When the divorce was first filed. He and Sylvia had not been married very long when Sylvia realized that Bruce was not who he seemed to be. Bruce was very, very money-oriented, and he decided that they were not going to have any joint accounts, that Sylvia was going to be solely responsible for her 3 children from her previous marriages. He was making a 6-figure income prior to losing his job. Sylvia got close to Bruce's mother, and through both doing the taxes and talking to Bruce's mom, Sylvia found out that Bruce had actually abandoned his first family. He had been in a long-term relationship, had a son named Matthew, and when Matthew was about a year old, when he was home alone with Bruce, Matthew somehow got into the swimming pool and had a near-drowning experience. Matthew went to the hospital. Bruce and Matthew's mother had never been married. Bruce tried to skip out on the bills, basically cut off all contact with Matthew and his mother once the doctors said that Matthew was going to make it, but he was likely never to walk again. And Bruce just went poof. But the whole time he had been claiming Matthew on his income taxes. This did not set well with Sylvia at all, and she decided that she was going to get a divorce. And Bruce's mother sided with Sylvia and actually testified on Sylvia's behalf during the divorce proceedings. And Bruce did not like this very much. His mother was supposed to be at the Ortega Christmas Eve party, but she had gotten ill that day, and it had been Bruce's intention to take his mother's life as well as the lives of Sylvia and her parents, her 2 brothers, her 2 sister-in-laws, and one of her sisters. And her nephew Michael was the only minor who was killed in this whole thing. He died solely from the fire. Other family members, a couple of them died solely from the gun, and others, it was a combination. Bruce had suffered 3rd-degree burns when the unexpected fire took place. He had been planning to use that flamethrower thing to get rid of any evidence of him being there. He had planned this out as being like the perfect crime. He was going to decimate the Ortega family, and then he was going to go over and take the life of Sylvia's divorce attorney. And after taking the divorce attorney's life, he was going to make his escape eventually to Mexico. He had planned this thing out so far in advance, 6 months in advance. He had begun buying the handguns. They were all 9mm semi-automatics, and the ammunition. He gathered some black powder. He got the high-octane fuel. He made the flamethrower. He commissioned a Santa suit. Cost him $300. Told the seamstress that he wanted it extra big, extra roomy, so he could be extra jolly, when actually it was to conceal the weapons. He put this flamethrower in a Christmas present The Santa suit had actually melted. Part of it had melted onto him, and he wasn't able to get that off. It was still on his skin. He decided then not to continue on to the attorney's house. He drove 40 miles to his brother's house, broke in, and took his own life on his brother's couch, which is incredibly selfish and just shows what a rotten guy he was, because Bruce's home was actually closer to the Ortega home than his brother's house, and he obviously would have been able to get into his own home quite easily instead of going to his brother's house to end himself. He had this all planned out. He had rented 2 different rental cars. One was the rental car that he took to the Ortega's house, and that's the one that the families on the street were able to identify to police. And so then the police found that one outside of Brad Pardo's home when they were investigating Bruce's unaliving himself. And when they looked in the car, they could see that it had been rigged, and it was rigged so that if you took the Santa suit out, it would go up. So they had the bomb unit come, and the car did become engulfed. Then they got calls from someone in a neighborhood in the Pasadena/Glendale area saying that there was a mysterious SUV parked on their street that had been there for a while. They just found it suspicious. Police went and checked that out, and it was a rental SUV. It was rented in the name of Bruce Pardo, and there were maps of Mexico, and there was basically the whole getaway kit there in the SUV. Chillingly, that SUV was parked about 500 feet from the home of Sylvia's attorney. When Bruce had been found inside of a girdle, he had $17,000 in cash and plane tickets. Anyway, all of this was part of his elaborate getaway scheme, which went all for naught when karma caught up with him, and he was in so much pain that he could not see any other way out of this than to unalive himself. And that was the Covina Massacre. Be safe out there and enjoy the holidays.